My name is Melanie Eindl. I am research associate at the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe, and I will guide you through tonight's program. 1 year ago today, Russian airstrikes targeted several cities across Ukraine, including the capital, Kyiv. The war that has been raging in eastern Ukraine since 2014 shaped up to a full-scale invasion. This has led to a lot of changes within the region and the global geopolitical dynamics. We will look at these developments that happened last year tonight, and I think they will deliver a lot of topics to discuss. So without further ado, I think we should get right into it. So now I am happy to introduce to you Alisa Muzek. She's program coordinator with focus on Eastern Europe and Central Asia at the International Development Law Organization. We're happy she could make it tonight and will share some of her thoughts on this day and also on the last year as a Ukrainian herself. So thank you, Alisa, for coming here.
Thank you so much. And thank you to IDM for organizing such an important event, such an important discussion on this unfortunately tragic anniversary. I believe that 24th of February is a day which changed not only lives of all of us, of all Ukrainians, but actually globally, the whole world, because Russian invasion brought truly global repercussions. And I think we've seen it over the year, be it in food supply, be it in energy, or subsequent political destabilization. It actually proved again that in our interconnected world, something what happens in one place doesn't really stay in that place. It also revealed a clear framework of confrontation between democracies and autocracies, between the countries which are actually following the rule of law and which societal life is based on the rule of law, and others who rather depend on the rule of force. In fact, for me, as a Ukrainian, it's actually not very easy to summarize this year in words and in emotions because it was the whole scale of them. And they were changing all the time. And there is this ugly face of violence of this war, but also the beautiful face of life and continuation of life and the support which Ukrainians have been receiving from all our friends and partners all over the world. It's definitely devastation, but again, it's support, it's grief, but it's also pride. It's happiness for liberated towns. I myself come from a town of Izum, which unfortunately became, I would say, rather infamous globally, and the fear and of expectations of what we will discover there. And it's actually happened after the liberation of the town, the mass graves, devastation, total ruin of the town. So it's been truly a difficult year, but it also showed the resilience of Ukrainians. It's resilience what has been built for actually years, especially since years of Euromaidan, actually also thanks to the great support of our Western partners, the European Union, who actually proclaimed a few years ago resilience as a main framework of the Eastern Partnership framework. So it's truly showed that Ukrainian society is resilient, Ukrainian democracy, Ukrainian institutions are resilient because the country continues to function, and despite the whole ongoing war and all the repercussions it brought with it. For me, it was also a year of abundant illusions. First of all, it's probably that, something what I heard so many times back in January, especially in February, a few days before the invasion, that Ukraine will not be able to resist. Ukraine will simply collapse. 24 hours, 48 hours, different experts gave us different time, and they proved to be wrong. Another illusion is about the coherent Russian armed forces. The Russian army was called the second strongest army in the world. Now in Ukraine, we jokingly call it the second strongest army in Ukraine. So I think it's also something which was built for years also as a narrative of strong Russian state, of failed Ukrainian corrupt state, for which unfortunately a lot, even unfortunately, and our Western partners sometimes fell for this narrative, but again, it proved to be wrong. Another illusion related to the formula, which in German I would quote Wandel durch Handel, the illusion, the trait, and the creation of interdependencies has actually a transformative power, including to authoritarian states. This tool didn't only proved to be inefficient and simply wrong, but in fact, it actually enabled Russia to for example, weaponize energy, and we saw it clearly with Nord Stream, etc. And probably the biggest illusion of Putin, of Kremlin, was that West will provide a weak and incoherent response. And in fact, the invasion actually brought Western allies together and make them much stronger than before. And I would say also, obviously, as our conference is focusing on the role of Central Eastern Europe, I would again, first of all, thank all our friends and partners and neighbors for playing such a crucial and role for years to helping Ukraine, and especially in last year. They've been really on the forefront of helping on everything, starting with welcoming millions of Ukrainians who had to run the horrors of this war, providing them with the most warm welcome possible, and also changing attitudes towards refugee, because we also know how the Central Europe also was perceived towards refugees, especially during refugee crisis. Obviously, the Central Eastern European partners and neighbors were also providing strong arms supply, but also advocating to other partners to help and lead this process. And last but not least, which also was very much appreciated in Ukraine, and it was hoped for, is the provision of candidacy status, EU candidacy status, because at the beginning, I myself was a bit skeptical whether we'll be able to obtain it or not, because I know that there was very strong resistance in some of the EU capitals. And also, again, thanks to the strong advocacy campaign and lobby campaign, also and support from Central Eastern European partners, this proved to be a reality. I can continue the list on and on, but I also don't want to, take much on behalf of the discussion. I would like also to thank you, the panelists, and I know that you've been working on the book, which I was happy to be part of the discussion initially, and discussing the relations between Ukraine and Slovakia back then, and the initial chapter. And probably quite a few things have changed, especially over the year. And there have been a lot of, obviously, historic differences between Ukraine and its immediate neighbors, and despite anything, last year we managed to overcome them. We managed to unite in the face of the threat and of aggression, and I believe also that it helped to shift Ukrainian diplomacy also towards more engagement with its immediate neighbors, which also, again, from my personal perspective, which might have not received sufficient attention before that. And though it's a very tragic day for us Ukrainians, and not only for Ukraine, I would like still to finish my intervention on a more positive note of unity. Just this day or yesterday, there was a recent poll published in Ukraine showing that almost 90% of Ukrainians are confident in our country's ability to successfully repel the ongoing invasion, to actually to win this war. And I would just like to call on our partners and friends, and to continue having faith in us, to continue supporting us, and not to get into fatigue mode, because this is something what is very challenging and a bit scary in perspective. And I believe that the unity of the West will overcome the threat of the Russian invasion. Thank you so much, and I wish you a fruitful discussion. I'll try to stay with you as long as I can before I have to jump into another discussion today.
Thank you, Elisa, for those interesting insights. Sorry, I think some of the people here wanted to applaud to you. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with you that the Ukrainians have very much showed their resilience in this last year, and it's also very nice to be ended with such a positive note. I think those encouraging words is something we all need these days. I am now also happy to welcome Ambassador Harald Stranzl. He is National Coordinator of the EUSDR, Head of the Foreign Trade Department at the Ministry for European and International Affairs in Vienna. He's also a member of the IDM board. So good evening, Ambassador, and you may have the floor.
Good evening, everybody. And first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to address you Today it is very timely and topical roundtable discussion in Ukraine and its role in Central and Eastern Europe. The previous speaker mentioned already my two hats, my two capacities. I will take my first hat and start with my foreign ministry's hat. A very somber anniversary today. We've heard it already. Exactly 1 year has passed since Russia launched an unprovoked and unjustifiable war of aggression against its neighbor Ukraine. 1 year of human suffering for women, children, and men. 1 year of missiles and drones raining down Ukrainian civilians. 1 year of deliberate attacks also to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure. With Russia's war, to be very clear, which is against the very principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations, the brutality of a full-scale war has returned to Europe. Russia is trying to draw borders using tanks and rockets, something we no longer thought possible in Europe in the 21st century. Austria's position on this war of aggression is crystal clear. The illegal use of war force by the Russian Federation against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine is unacceptable and unjustifiable. Austria stands therefore in full solidarity with Ukraine, its government, and also the Ukrainian people. In the past year, we have seen millions of lives uprooted and millions of people fleeing their homes to seek shelter elsewhere. Many of them, over 90,000, have sought refuge in Austria. Thousands of Austrian families hosted displaced persons from Ukraine in their homes. Austria bilaterally, in addition to our support for European Union support, provided 124 million euros in humanitarian assistance with focus on winterization, energy support, and basic needs, and so much more has already been done. As a committed European myself, it's particularly painful to follow the events. Until a year ago, we assumed that the European continent would continue to grow together instead of apart. Nevertheless, or even more than ever, our goal remains to bring Ukraine into the European family. Russia's military aggression will not be able to change that, will not be able to stop that. Therefore, we particularly welcome Ukraine's EU candidate status and the further deepening of relations, also in the framework of the pre-accession process to European Union, which has been launched. In my capacity as the Foreign Ministry's national coordinators of the EU strategy for the Danube region, let me stress that also regional cooperation formats, such as the European strategy for the Danube region, EUSTR, are useful tools to support Ukraine on its path to Europe. Despite the profoundly difficult circumstances, it's all the more remarkable that Ukraine has shown real leadership in mastering a dedicated EUSTR presidency last year. During the war, it was a war presidency, all the more remarkable. Ukraine was the first non-EU member state in this presidency role, seeing, of course, also the merits of cooperation on an equal footing already now between the 9 EU member states and the 5 non-EU member states cooperating in the Danube area. The war in Ukraine, as cynical as this may sound, brought a new momentum to the European Union strategy for the Danube region. Why? Because the war showed us how interconnected the Danube region in terms of food security, energy, transport, security, and migration is. Ukraine made also clear to us during its presidency the specific added value of this cooperation in the Danube area, with the Danube River being Ukraine's lifeline during the blockage of Black Sea ports by Russia. The question will also be now and in the coming months, what can we do? What can also this European strategy in the Danube region, which I are responsible of here in Austria in the Foreign Ministry, what can we do to make a difference for Ukraine and also for Moldova, by the way, to help Ukraine in its reconstruction efforts and to help the candidate countries on their path of gradual integration into the EU. Austria will certainly focus on this important question and issue, will focus on Ukraine when Austria will take over the EUSTR presidency on the 1st of November this year. Now let me take my second hat and add a couple of remarks from the IDM perspective. Gladly enough prepared for me to read it out to you. 1 year ago, the news about the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine reached, of course, also the EDM team. Like all of us, it left us in shock, but definitely not in action. The team reacted on the same day with a statement of solidarity with Ukraine as well, on all IDM channels, including a call to action for donations and links for Ukrainians seeking help in shelter in Austria. The tragic incidents showed once more how important the work of think tanks like EDM is. Throughout the year and until this very day, a variety of activities and publications proved the EDM's support for Ukraine. I will just mention a couple of them. On the initiative of the late EDM chairman, Dr. Erhard Busek, and with the effort of the whole team, as well as the Danube Rectors Conference, the Institute could secure 2 fellowships of Ukrainian scholars in Vienna. Anastasia Lendl stayed with the EDM from June to September 2022, Olga Kirichenko and her son Vitaly from May to November 2022. The fellowships created valuable exchange opportunities between the young academics and the EDM team. More about their stories can be read on the EDM blog. Numerous EDM events put their focus on the unprovoked war and gathered Ukrainians from various positions and levels of education. The 17th DRS Summer School was initially planned to take place in the Ukrainian city of Uzhhorod, but had to be relocated, unfortunately, to Vienna. Discussing the future of education in the EDM's target region, a special focus was given to education and mobility in the shadow of war. The results of the summer school were published in the first issue of 2023 of the scientific journal Der Donauraum. I already saw some copies of it here also in this room. When the atrocities happened in Bucha became public, Anatoly Kuglashov, head of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration and director of the Institute of European Integration and Regional Studies at the Yuri Fedkovich-Cheritsky National University, was invited for an EDM on-site. Moreover, together with the same institute and the Center for the Study of Conflict and Peace at the University of Osnabrück, EDM organized the conference Regional Perspectives on the War in Ukraine. In addition to that, 4 podcast episodes in the last year dealt with the efforts of war in the lives of Ukrainians. These were about education, flight, and the reality of being queer during the war. The EDM team, I'm coming to the end already now, in its several publications creatively reported about Ukraine. 2 issues of its policy paper series discussed Ukraine's future in the European Union. In the journalistic publication Info Europa, EDM looked at the future and presence of European town twinning projects with Russian and Ukrainian cities. Finally, EDM Secretary General Sebastian Schäfer, who's of course also with us today, edited the book Ukraine and Central and Eastern Europe, which will also be part of the following discussion, as we have further authors here on the panel with us. His forthcoming book, Ukraine and Moldova nach Europa, so in German, sofort, will be published soon. Last but not least, the EDM team relentlessly proved its expertise and expressed its solidarity in interviews with several media outlets, on panels and conferences, lectures and seminars. There were too many to enumerate them all here and now. Therefore, I now don't want to take more time of our discussion and panelists. And I'd like to hand over again either to the moderator or already to the panelists. Thank you for having me here, and thank you and all the best for future discussions.
Thank you, Ambassador Strandberg. On the panel, I now welcome Andreas Umland. He is analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Federica Mangiamelli, she is stream manager for defense and security at Blocksec. And Sebastian Schäfer, he's managing director at the IDM. As you already heard, they all contributed to the book Ukraine and Central and Eastern Europe, which you can also get later here after the discussion. So just a small note on the procedure for everyone in the room. I will open the floor for questions from the audience twice. So if you have any question, you can then just raise your hand and pose your question. everybody who joins us on YouTube and on Zoom, you can post your questions in the chat, maybe also indicate if you want to direct your question at a certain panelist. If you're present on Zoom, you can of course also just raise your hands once I open the floor and ask the question yourself. You can also post your questions on Twitter under the hashtag Ukraine in CEE. So let's get into the discussion, I would say. Before we dive into the rather hard topics, I would like to ask you all a more personal question. Also, feel free to share your answer to this question under the hashtag on Twitter, because I believe that February 24, 2022 has created a momentum in the lives of each and every one of us. Just like the 9/11 attacks, everybody I talked to knows the exact moment when they heard the news from Ukraine on this day. So could now maybe you just briefly recap when you first heard about the attack? Maybe Sebastian, you would like to start.
Well, Melanie, thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, I don't think I will ever forget that. I was woken up by my wife, and she said it started, and I couldn't believe it because I thought it's not possible. I was supposed to fly to Kyiv on the 21st of February. I decided against it. I've said this on numerous occasions, and I was feeling very bad for it because I was cowardly chickening out of going, and I had this irrational hope that this would, you know, if you bring an umbrella, it will not rain, and it started to rain, but it rained bombs, and yeah, that was the moment for everyone.
Thanks for sharing this with us. Federica, how did you feel when you first heard about the news from Ukraine?
I totally agree with what you said concerning the remarkable day that is going to stay with us forever. I definitely think the 24th of February is going to be a second 9/11. Personally, it happened in the early morning. I just have this flash news on my phone, and I will never forget looking at it. Russia invades Ukraine, the war started. This is the statement that I think will stay with me forever. And the feeling in that very moment is a mix of disbelief and shock. And yes, it was a very strong moment.
Andreas, what was your reaction when you heard about shelling in Kyiv?
Yeah, and first of all, I was not in Kyiv, although I was living in Kyiv, and I was on a business trip with my center in Stockholm, and heard it there. I had a flight back booked with Baltic Air. I was supposed to, I think, on the 26th to return to Kyiv, and the flight did not take place, and I did not immediately go back. I have also family obligations in Germany. So yeah, this was a historic moment in the negative sense. Although somehow I still also remember when I, in 2014, heard about these strange events happening in Crimea. That was sort of already something that in a way then worried me more, because in February, that was in February 2014. In February 2022, it was already pretty clear that something would happen. And when actually the bombing started, I wasn't yet sure what that actually means. Was that just perhaps a short-term sort of terror strike? Would it be an invasion perhaps only of eastern Ukraine? Or would it indeed then become this full invasion that it then became, and the attempt to even take Kyiv? We had actually, with a colleague in Stockholm, we had actually outlined these scenarios. So it was pretty clear that something would happen, because the troops were there, and to just withdraw them would have been sort of impossible at that point. But that it then turned out to be really such a long war that was, I think I was actually more surprised later on when the attack on Kyiv then was, and when it turned out that is really not just a signal or something, or a warning, but that is actually an attempt to capture Ukraine, and to actually occupy Ukraine, which I couldn't sort of believe because it was sort of unrealistic. It seems to me from the very beginning.
Thanks for sharing this. Yes, I think also I had this moment today when it was very unrealistic for me that this is actually 1 year ago today. Andreas, I would like to stay with you for my next question because in the recent days and also today, for example, we heard proposals from other countries like China today who encourage, if we can say it like that, Ukraine and Russia for peace negotiations. And you recently commented on that about the possibilities or let's say impossibilities of actual peace negotiations because Ukraine and Russia, the Russian Federation, claim the same territories in their constitution. So if they would, in peace negotiations, any of them like give up those territories, they would actually violate constitutional law. My question in this regard is, if peace negotiations won't end this war, what will? How will this war end?
In a way, I mean, this reaction is very similar in its motivation to at least my motivation. I don't know how like it is with Sebastian, who was the main editor, but I was involved in triggering the project. We had first a conference, and then we had the cooperation between two institutes, the IDM and the Ukrainian Institute for the Future in Kyiv, where then Pavlo Klimkin was appointed a regional program director, and this program does not exist anymore. But that was a book that, for me, to a large degree, came out of frustration. Just frustration that Ukraine would have to develop and would have to spend more attention to its partners in Central and Eastern Europe, because basically the partners in Western Europe are no good. They have sort of other interests, they have other viewpoints, and they simply don't understand what's happening. And they don't understand Russia. They don't understand basic facts. So we have, for instance, in Germany, the Bible of the so-called Russia understanders, which is called Russland verstehen. And the problem with this book, Russland verstehen, is not so much that it says many ridiculous things, but that it is about Ukraine. It's a book called Russland verstehen, and the whole book is actually about Ukraine and how Russia sees Ukraine, and you don't actually know about Russia, and that is now what I'm also seeing, that people don't know that Russia has a constitution. In the constitution, there are now 5 new oblasts. The president is the guarantor of the Russian constitution, and he is obliged in negotiations, if he would come to negotiations, to not only could he be accused of high treason if he gives away territory that, according to the Russian constitution, belongs to the Russian Federation, but he would actually be obliged to ask in negotiations Ukraine to give Russia additional territory, because according to the Russian constitution, there are territories in Ukraine that belong to the Russian Federation. And so the content of these negotiations that many people want, and I, in a way, also want negotiations and peace and so on, the content, as determined by the Russian constitution, of these negotiations would be, from the Russian side, to get additional territory from Ukraine in order to fulfill the Russian constitution. And if you don't do that, you can actually, as a Russian president or Russian foreign minister or negotiator, get into trouble. So this is one of the, and it's just frustrating to see that people, yeah, we want negotiations and so on, but they don't understand these basic facts, and they don't. I mean, there are other reasons why these negotiations don't make sense, because we had many of similar negotiations before. We had treaties before. Moldova has a treaty with Russia about withdrawing troops. Georgia has a treaty with Russia about withdrawing troops. We have several documents concerning Ukraine and Russia about withdrawal of troops, Geneva Declaration, Minsk I, Minsk II, and so on. And none of these treaties were fulfilled. So you can sign something with Russia. This will sound good, but what for? Because we have a 1994 treaty between Moldova and Russia that has still not been fulfilled, almost 30 years ago. And Moldova, by the way, is a bloc-free country. That means it does not enter NATO and so on. And there are other reasons as well why these negotiations simply don't make sense. But still people believe in the negotiation. So what is left here is to not do what we've already tried several times, but to actually to win the war. This is the only solution. There's no other solution. We've tried the other things already. The Russian constitution forbids giving away territory. And there's also now, by the way, a large Russian constitution. Not only is there a large constituency in Ukraine that would not agree to any territorial secessions, there's now also in Russia a large domestic constituency that would be strictly against giving away any territories because they've lost a lot. They've lost their comrades, their health, their lives in Ukraine fighting for these territories. And so what is left is unfortunately only a military solution because it's a war. It's not some sort of conflict.
Thank you. I maybe have a follow-up question on this bill because even before February 2022, there have been attempts from European politicians to somehow mediate the situation. We had Macron and Scholz talking with Putin. All of these have failed. What does it mean for European diplomacy? Have political means of safeguarding peace in Europe reached a limit?
Yeah, I think these visits by Macron and Scholz in early 2022, they were principally misunderstood. What Putin wanted in these sessions to know is, would Germany and France support Ukraine when the war starts? And they did not give the right. If they had indicated that we would go as far as we now do, delivering major Western battle tanks, the Leopards and others, and perhaps also at some point then fighter planes. If Putin had then gotten this address, maybe the war would not have happened. Maybe if he knew that the stakes would be really high and that even countries like Germany and France would at the end of the day come around. But they tried to talk with him about the Minsk agreement. That was a ridiculous sort of conversation of the death with the Stugger und der Taube, the death and the blind and yeah. So there was no conversation actually. There was no diplomacy. It was understood by the Western leaders as diplomacy, but that was not at that point. There were so many troops there that something that was already clear that something would happen, and it should have been a very different diplomacy, if you like. They should have, if they had gone, they should have said, "Listen, this is going to be a war between you and the West," and then maybe we would have had something different. So. Yeah, I mean, Russian imperialism, unfortunately, has not ended in 1991. Perhaps there was a chance for it to end in 1991. It has continued, and it will continue until it is defeated, militarily defeated. I don't think there's another way. As it was with German imperialism, I don't want to comment here Austrian imperialism, which was very different from German, but it needs to be defeated, and you cannot negotiate away an imperial tradition. This is still what many people in Germany and I'm afraid in Austria have also in mind. They want to talk the imperial tradition away, and then perhaps people in Moscow will forget about the empire. Unfortunately, that is not how the world works.
Talking about military support to Ukraine and the security architecture in Europe, it was mainly designed for times of peace. So many countries here in Europe are not nearly as militarily equipped as Russia. And if they continue to supply Ukraine with arms and ammunition, and this war continues for several years, they will have to step up their arms industry. How likely is Ukraine to withstand the Russian aggression and the EU to support Ukraine in this regard in the long run? And How dependent is the European Union on NATO in this regard?
Well, this leads me to one little comment from President Macron back in 2019 when he said NATO is brain dead. Well, if there is sadly something that the war in Ukraine has showed is that NATO is not brain dead, and it was able to swiftly react to what was happening in Ukraine. But in this, I would like to actually connect what Andreas was mentioning and discussing military support with countries who don't know Russia, who haven't had any link with Russia in general, is really hard, because it's going to always be like the war in Ukraine for most of the Western countries. And this is the major issue at this point. And this is the major concern when it comes to extending extending the war. And as a consequence, we will have to continue, because we have to continue to military support Ukraine. So this opens to a variety of scenarios. And honestly, coming to your questions concerning the European Union, if there's another thing that the war in Ukraine has showed, is that the European Union architecture is totally dependent on NATO and the US, and it is something that in the long run cannot be withstand. And I was reading something on Estonian spending, military spending, that is decreased after the Cold War to about 1%. And this is something that we could not, and these are numbers that we cannot use. We cannot, they are not good for us if we want to continue to provide armaments to Ukraine. So on one hand, after the war, we had the strategic compass that was adopted by the European Union in March, and that was very defense and deterrent centric. And on the other side, we had NATO revising the strategic concept, also including possible strategies to better cooperate and counter Russia. But on the other hand, you have the debates in European capitals where they still think about not providing offensive enough military capabilities to Ukraine. So I was reading this quote from this German parliamentarian. It said, "It feels like we are arming Ukraine to not lose the war but not to win the war." And as Andreas was mentioning, there's only one way for the European security and also for Ukraine out of this situation, and it's Ukraine winning the war. There's nothing. Russia is always going to be a threat for the security of the European Union and the European continent as a whole. So there's only one strategy that we can pursue, and it's arming Ukraine and helping Ukraine win this war.
Thank you. Sebastian, would you like to add to anything we've heard so far?
Well, I mean, of course, I think that this false balancing that is happening in this discourse is not something that we should feed into. So you cannot expect me to like sort of balance out. I'm just echoing what has been mentioned, and I happily reiterate, yes, the only way is that Ukraine wins this war. Maybe I can add to the overall idea that Andreas mentioned of that book, and the very understanding of what the regional cooperation is why the regional cooperation is so important. I completely also here echo what you said, that this is very important. I also think, and this is something that I would issue as a criticism towards the European Union, that I have been from the very beginning, when the Eastern Partnership started, argued that they should give at least a perspective of membership to the target countries. And non-EU official and none of the member countries dared to do that. Stefan Füle, after he was commissioner, tweeted that. I remember that. But none of them were dared to do it. And then something like a full-scale invasion has to happen that we finally step. It's good. It's fine. And I hope we continue this path very, very quickly with the European integration also of Ukraine and Moldova. and in perspective also with Georgia. But the question that we should ask ourselves is, why did it take so long, and why does it have to happen? Why does a catastrophe like this have to happen until we finally step up?
I will come back to the candidate status a bit later, but a question I have as a follow-up, maybe, if Ukraine wins the war, what happens to the Russian Federation? What happens, I mean, the Russian Federation on a broader scale, but what happens also to the Kremlin on a smaller scale, if we can say it like this?
I don't know how winning the war will look like. I don't think that there will be, there's this fear that I read today that the weapons that are provided to Ukraine could be used against the Russian Federation on their territory. I don't know if winning the war would mean that all of the currently occupied territories of the Russian Federation would be liberated at that stage. But I believe that if Ukraine wins that war, the Russian Federation in its current state will cease to exist. And there will be certainly very challenging developments that will also have repercussions for, especially, again, the neighboring countries of the Russian Federation, but also all of us. And we should brace ourselves for that. We should prepare ourselves for that, and then not be surprised of it again. I can't really predict how such a disintegration will look like. I just know that what we will need to have is this sort of decolonialization at the end of this process. But until we get to this, I'm afraid that there is a lot of terror, destruction, and life lost on that way.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I look at the audience already and want to see if there are any questions so far. Yes, please, could you stand up and introduce you shortly?
I'm Mr. Bellinger from the Austrian Committee for NATO membership, and we also work for Ukraine's NATO membership. A question to the audience is about NATO membership of Ukraine, because this was very much about this one. How realistic is it now to give Ukraine the NATO map, similar like we have given the candidate status to the EU? The logic would be now the next step, and to secure Ukraine, because more or less militarily it's already integrated in our defense structures. How can we make this political step now to make clear that Ukraine is with us and we will win this war that way?
Thank you. Anybody here who wants
To
to
maybe
address
be a
this
bit controversial and not always. I'm skeptical. Actually, the book is also one of the results of my, at least from, again, I'm only speaking for myself here, and you and Pavlo Klimkin and others who were involved in that may have had totally different motivations. One of the reasons that I started dealing with the intermarium concept that we have written here in this book about was that I don't think that NATO membership, unfortunately, is easily achieved. A Polish scholar, Andrzej Szeptycki, very nicely once mentioned to me, the problem here is it's basically like with an insurance company. You sign the insurance before the event happens. You cannot go to an insurance company and come and say, my house is burning, so I want to sign the insurance treaty now. So that is the dilemma that Ukraine is in. And when I'm quite often on Ukrainian in Ukrainian media, and I'm trying to sort of bring this sad story in rather stark terms to my Ukrainian friends, namely that I think that Ukraine may only. I hope I'm wrong. I'm totally. I would if you ask me, Ukraine should enter NATO today rather than tomorrow. But I'm usually then saying Ukraine may only enter NATO when it does not need NATO anymore. That is the odd dilemma that Ukraine is. Then all of the 30 members, or how many it will be, then will agree. You need the full consensus. That's also the problem. It's not just that you have some, and we've seen that in 2008 when the first application was submitted by Georgia and Ukraine, and the US was was positive, and the East European member countries were positive, but Germany and France vetoed the applications. I think the real scandal was the vetoing of the application of Georgia, really, because Georgia was fully prepared and had 80% of the population for NATO membership. Ukraine was a bit more, you could argue, because you then had actually 60% of the population being against NATO membership. So there was a certain narrative that you could present. I mean, there was still an application from the Ukrainian government, but at least you could there have some sort of justification for sort of postponing that and saying, well, you need at least, not half of the population being against NATO membership before we start the membership action plan. But for Georgia, it should have come then, because there was no good reason to reject it for Georgia. And then half a year later, Georgia got then the bill with the invasion of Georgia, and then the de facto annexation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the creation of these pseudo republics, and the Russian troops simply not withdrawing from Georgian state territory, as was agreed in a treaty that, again, I'm coming back to there's a treaty, the so-called Sarkozy plan, which states that troops should be withdrawn, and the Russians didn't. So they signed it, but why would you do what you signed, right? So so that was the story then, and I'm afraid it will remain like that. There will be always some countries in NATO among the 30 that will say no. We're not going to enter this. We're not going to let Ukraine in as long as Ukraine is in this conflict with Russia. That's unfortunately. That's why we need to talk about the intermarium and security guarantees and special relationships, and that was one of the motivations of this book. If Ukraine wants security, it needs to, for now, it has to try to get it from somewhere else.
Yes.
My name is Alfred Kraus. I'm president of the Ukrainian Austrian Association. To start with, Andreas, you know that I have been in Kyiv when the whole thing started, and it was not expected. I can only confirm what was stated here. Me and my wife, we were invited by the then acting ambassador of the US, Christina Queen, and there have been some friends of her, like Melinda Simmons, like Anka Feldhusen, etc., at a private party when saying goodbye by Christina Queen for Tom, her husband, who had to return to the United States several weeks before the war was started. I may tell that at this private conversation with 5 or 6 ambassadors, nobody believed that there would be a full invasion. And that was beginning of February. I don't speak 10 days or 5 days before, but beginning of February. Talking about the future, I think we should focus now even more and much more on what has to be done now, rather than think theoretically what would be the options and this and that. We can't fully influence what will happen. So we should see what we can influence. And 2 or 3 aspects in this respect. First, the international industry is still not in unity, and there are big international groups, world market players, who would like very much and who do still business with Russia. Direct, indirect. So if you say a lot of Western companies have left Russia, this is not true. This is maybe 10 or 20% true, but 80% have stayed. Even if they have sold their businesses, they have an option to take it back. Just a moment.
But do you also have a question? Because if not, I would leave it maybe to the discussion later after the panel discussion.
Later. Last, just a short remark. But the point is, for example, sanctions. Sanctions are circumvented to a high degree. Take NATO member Turkey. Last sentence. Electrical parts components and circuits, electrical circuits, exports by Turkey, 21, several $100,000 or euro, to 22, 85 or 90 million. This is a clear sign of circumvention of sanctions. This is where we should concentrate in order to create unity. Sorry.
Thank you. Does somebody want to pick up on this on the panel?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a touchy topic, because that may mean then not just talking to Turkey, but actually sanctioning also Turkey for doing that. But these are the so-called secondary sanctions or tertiary sanctions. Well, yeah, I think, I mean, I wish we would have come there already much earlier. Blinken has now actually, if I remember that correctly, has talked about the secondary sanctions about concerning China. I mean, that means sanctions not against Russian companies, but against non-Russian companies that cooperate with Russia. Yeah.
Indirect.
Yeah. So, but that would mean then de facto, let's be frank, a global trade war, because then we would have to sanction many countries around the world. But maybe that may be needed. Actually, the UN resolution that we just had seems to suggest that, because, you know, if the UN in its overwhelming majority is of this opinion, then that seems to me is a legitimate basis then to say we need secondary sanctions, and we need to sanction the companies that support this war, either with military technology or dual technology, or just with supporting the Russian economy. So, yeah, I mean, if we're serious about it, it would have come to come to this.
Maybe to pick up on it and stay a little bit more in the now than in the future. Talking about the EU candidate status of Ukraine, Federica, you and Sebastian write in a chapter in the book that the EU has to enhance its relevance and reliability as a partner of Ukraine. And you wrote this article before February 2022, and before Ukraine and Moldova were granted candidate status. However, you also write that the EU does not represent a guarantee to safety. We have already touched a little bit upon that, especially as opposed to NATO. So my question is, what about this candidate status benefits Ukraine at the moment? And also conversely, what's in it for the EU to approximate a country at war?
So the 23rd of June became a very important date for us, because it was the day that Moldova and Ukraine were granted the candidate status membership. So it meant a lot. First of all, it has a symbolic value for Ukrainians who are on the front line. They are fighting on the ground, that all their efforts are seen from someone. Because let's face it, since 2014, and it is not a problem that only concerns Ukraine, the European Union has been neglecting basically its neighbors. And so this sort of acknowledgement of all the reform process that have been made since the association agreement have been awarded with this candidate status. It comes at a time when the war has already started. So, but still, indeed, it represents a starting point. What I would like to stress is that the candidate status is not an ending point, is rather at the beginning of a cooperation. So now it's going to be important how the EU is going to actually operate in support of this rapprochement of Ukraine towards the European Union. Because we've seen that there's always a lot of talk in Brussels and European capitals. There's a lot of symbolic political speech, but then when it comes to actually operate, there are always debates. So I would say this is an important moment for Ukraine, despite the critical and dramatic circumstances. But in this, it also lies an opportunity. And also when it comes to the talks on the reconstruction of Ukraine, this could be an opportunity for the EU to help rebuild Ukraine, where with some structures that are closer to what are the regulations and the standards of the European Union. So we should, with the candidate state, we acknowledge the efforts undertaken by Ukraine, and but at the same time, it's the beginning of a further cooperation, and with the reconstruction, I believe is gonna be crucial. But I also want to say to what has been said already, that operational efficiency on the ground right now is what we need. And the European defense industry is not able to produce armaments on demand. And this is something we should actually work on to increase the productivity of the defense industry at the EU level, if we want to continue to arm Ukraine and let it win the war.
Thank you. Do you want to add to this, Sebastian? I mean, you have also written this chapter together.
Well, I mean, when it comes to the European integration process, I think I sound like a broken record because I stress over and over again that I think it's going to be important that we take this away from single member states being able to block that process. And I think this is something that we are already experiencing to a certain degree when it comes to, for instance, prolonging sanctions. We see that when it comes to NATO membership of Finland and Sweden. You know? And I fear that this is something that will be exploited on the expense of the new candidate countries, because we see that with the already existing candidate countries in the Western Balkans. And then, and this is the second challenge that I would add to this, that we not only need to have a supranational enlargement process because it's becoming far too technical and too much power on a single member country. The second thing is that there are other candidate countries that have been waiting to access the European Union for 2 decades. And this overall, I mean, is going to be quite a challenge for the next years.
I see you might want to say something. Just a short follow-up question. Why was Georgia not included in this candidate granting situation? We had those 3 countries, right? And then it was Ukraine and Moldova. Why not Georgia?
It's been argued on the basis of the need of certain reforms, which would also apply to the other countries of this associated trio coming out of the Eastern Partnership, especially when it comes to the rule of law. But there is also a challenge going on inside the country that has been mentioned with regards to before they can receive candidate status, they would have to undergo further reforms here. But it's so to say, it's similar to I would compare it to the status that was granted back at the summit in Thessaloniki 2003, that there are potential candidate countries once they are ready, and this is something that is applied to Georgia in that sense as well.
Just to be again a little bit controversial, and in continuing to what Sebastian said, I think now this behavior, especially of Hungary, creates both direct and indirect problems for countries like Ukraine. Directly because Hungary is simply blocking certain decisions. We had earlier already a similar policy in NATO, where Hungary has also used its sort of veto right to block NATO Ukraine cooperation. But also this behavior, of course, then creates these sort of fears in the West now that we will get new members in, and then they will also start to misbehave. And then you have a change, and then, or even a politician which seemed fine at some point, then becomes crazy and then sort of starts blocking the whole thing. So you know, when I'm seeing now these strains within the EU, I get almost the impression that the full institutional membership for countries like Ukraine will only come once the EU has reformed itself, either signed a new treaty where the majority voting is formally and sort of constitutionally, one could say, introduced, or within the Lisbon Treaty. I'm not a legal expert enough to know whether that's possible actually within the Lisbon Treaty. But my fear is now that countries, the older countries, will become skeptical, not only concerning the financial burdens that will come then with the new members, but also whether this will make actually decision making then impossible. And then I'm also again, and maybe you are more expert here, there's still the mutual defense clause also in the Lisbon Treaty, 42.7, I think, and that is also, of course, something that is for a country like Ukraine a problem, because it's not as strong perhaps as Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, but it's also a mutual defense clause. It means at least something. We have not yet really seen what it means in practice, but it would have to mean something, obviously, and that could also be, in the worst case, that could also mean that Ukraine will have to first end the war with Russia and then and can enter. I think the EU will be less complicated in a way, although it's more technical, it's more difficult. The path is more difficult. I would think that at the end of the path there is actually the entry into the union. Whereas with NATO, I don't know. Even if they become totally, if the army becomes totally standardized with NATO, and and the parliamentary control and all of these, the membership action plan fulfilled to 100%, I'm not sure the membership is going to come out of it. The chance, however, that I see now with the candidacy that we may get to a new sort of accession process, this what has been called staged accession, that even though there are these new problems emerging out of the war and out of Hungary's behavior for Ukraine, that perhaps the accession procedure will be then reformed, and then countries like Moldova and Ukraine, they will then become gradually members of this agency and that mechanism. And I mean, it's already happening. They are already de facto part of the single market, because the special regulations and also basically the whole, I mean, the main argument was always against not Ukraine letting in, because we will then have all the immigrants from Ukraine, but now we have them already. So, and we have now this special protection mechanism, which is actually, a freedom of movement already de facto implemented, although it's called a different way. So, and maybe then, this could be actually applied in a more systematic way, and then actually made a new accession process, and then that would be sort of some light in the top tunnel before the final light of the full institutional membership, and also some successes. I think that was also a big motivation here for giving finally the candidate status, to provide some feeling of success and some sort of psychological support, because at the end of the day they have the association agreement, which basically prepares for membership, and that's the odd way, the odd thing about I mean, it's a huge treaty that implements the acquis. So once you've implemented the association agreement, you're already largely ready for membership. So, but still, I think the psychological support was enormously important, and maybe then the staged accession will actually be the main contribution then of the candidacy to the whole process.
Can I just maybe briefly add to what Andreas mentioned about the mutual defense clause and also the institutional reform? I think definitely institutional reform would be something that regardless of any events should be on the table. At the latest, it should have started after the Brexit vote. And if we actually would have done starting the process back then, if we look at the average time that it takes to reform primary law of the European Union, we would have a new treaty by now. Anyway, this Article 42.7, it basically comes from this Western European Union, which would actually traditionally even have a harder defense assistance. And it's phrased like this because it says, with all means necessary. But the difference then again is that it respects neutrality of certain EU member countries. And as you pointed out, it has never been really applied. It was invoked one time when the terror attacks in France happened in 2016, but it has never been sort of applied when one country attacked another country, attacked an EU member country that is protected under this. So we simply don't know. I think that to achieve EU membership, we would have to at least see a sort of peace agreement or stopping of the hostilities. And then I would see that a European Union membership is much easier possible than the NATO membership, as you said, because we've seen that the EU is ready to bring in countries that have some conflicts in on their territory, and therefore this would probably be the way I could see this.
Thank you. Do you still need to add something?
Actually, one thing, yes, and it's also linked to the question on NATO membership, that I think that considering that in the long run, the NATO membership is not a realistic goal for Ukraine, we should definitely discuss about security guarantees and, establish some mechanism to allow Ukraine to safeguard its own sovereignty. As we've seen, Russia doesn't stop in front of signing an agreement or signing any sort of documentary negotiation. So this is also something we should start working now. And in this sense, I would say that the best way to make sure that Ukraine can defend its own borders is to cooperate and strengthen the military resilience of Ukraine. So working with Ukrainians, cooperating with Ukrainians on the ground, and working with all sorts of advanced technology and allow Ukraine to defend its own territory without any foreign aid. So this is the best security guarantee we can establish. But to do so, in the first moment, we need a cooperation with NATO countries and partners of NATO to achieve this goal.
Another country, a neighboring country, actually, Moldova, was also granted candidate status. Sebastian, you recently talked in an interview about the allegations of a potential Russian staged coup in Moldova. How realistic is an escalation beyond Ukraine, and where would further possible Russian targets lie in the countries of the Eastern Partnership?
I think that the immediate danger is not there at the moment, but as we have seen over the past years, even there are constant interference from the side of the Russian Federation, also in Moldova. We see this sort of, was it today or yesterday where it was issued by the Russian Ministry of Defense that Ukraine is preparing to invade Transnistria, which is okay. I mean, it's semantics because you cannot invade a country that doesn't exist. But apart from that, Ukraine is not going to invade and immediately pose a danger to the Russian-speaking population, and therefore. It's the MO that we have seen in several cases from the Russian Federation. I think that they are not able to, at the moment, act militarily, but what they are doing is that they are continuing their disinformation campaign in the country. We see that there are demonstrations going on against the government. The government also felt the need to exchange the prime minister just 2 weeks ago, and so these things are certainly going to continue, because destabilizing in various fields will distract possibilities and will solve disunity within the European Union. We could see that in the Western Balkans. We could see that amongst EU member countries, And therefore, I would be very, very careful monitoring what the situation looks like, and I would echo here again what the Russian the Moldovan president Maya Sandu said, that the Moldovan society should act with maximum vigilance, and this caution is something that is really called for.
Talking about the countries of the Eastern Partnership, Andreas, you proposed in the foreword of the book that a post-colonial approach would encompass these countries in the notion of Central Europe. In a recent tweet, you furthermore claimed that the label Eurasia has proto-fascist connotations. Can you shortly elaborate on those two concepts? And is there a time and necessity to talk about terminology during a war?
Yeah, I think, but because these terms, they shape our thinking. This is not a trivial issue. This is how we imagine. We cannot only imagine the world via words. This is how we think. And I was always, I mean, having studied Eurasianism and written a dissertation on it, I was always stunned by the usage of the term Eurasian in much of the sort of academics. We have a, association for Eurasian and Slavic and East European studies. We have centers for Eurasians, and I was always asking, what's Eurasia here? Because Eurasia is, in the geological sense, the Euro-Asiatic entire continent. But we are not studying Indonesia and Saudi Arabia. We are just studying what is actually sort of northern Eurasia, you could argue, and northeastern Eurasia, because we also don't study Scandinavia when we do Eurasian study. And then the reference point is, of course, the redefinition of Eurasia by the so-called Eurasianists, a group of intellectuals in interwar Europe who thought that they had discovered a third continent between Europe and Asia that they called Eurasia. And that continent has a special civilization, which is idiocratic, which is traditionalistic, which is anti-liberal, which is anti-individualistic, which is a sort of a fascist society. That is the specificity of this Eurasia. And still, we are still using this term Eurasia, and that is the reference point. And I'm not even talking here about neo-Eurasianism of Alexander Dugin, who is even more strange, and who was, so Eurasia, I've said, has proto-fascist connotations, whereas the neo-Eurasianism of Dugin is, of course, fully fascist. That's just the Russian version of contemporary fascism. But the classical Eurasianists, they have been compared first by a close colleague of mine, Leonid Lux, at the Catholic University of Eichstätt, with the German Conservative Revolution, which was also arguably a proto-fascist intellectual movement. People like Carl Schmitt and Oswald Spengler and Ernst Jünger and so on, and he has sort of seen a certain structural similarity in their thinking. So that's why I think Eurasia should be just put out. It's a ridiculous term. Central European was the other term. I mean, that was more like a little bit of play with words. But what we meant here, and the idea comes actually from Pavlo Klimkin, which I have then elaborated. We've sort of written the article together, but I've sort of written most of it, I would say. So the idea here is that we have that many of the nations of Europe are former imperial nations. They had empires, the Germans, the Austrians, the French, the Spanish on the west, but also in the east. The Russians, the Serbians, if you like, the Turks, yeah, they had their empires, or if you Serbia see also as a sort of small empire. And then you have the nations who have not this imperial experience, but who have instead been colonies of one or even more of these empires. Yeah, and so what comes out of that, and we see that now in the practical behavior actually of these nations, is a different view of the world. That the Germans and the French and the Spanish, and they have one one view of the world, and the Russians and the Turks, and the Central Europeans, they have another view of the world, and they, and that leads actually to practical cooperation. It has actually policy implications. It's not just about words. It's actually, you can see that reflected, for instance, to come back to the NATO membership in the statement of how many, 9, I think, East European nations that supported Ukraine's application for NATO membership. And for the 3 Seas initiative, where I was very pleased to learn that Austria also takes part, which is actually a former imperial nation, but still it has also joined the 3 Seas initiative, or the Lublin Triangle. So you have actually many expressions of this community of peoples who have in the past often killed each other. They have a very dark past with Ukrainians and Polish. There are very dark pages in their history, and with others too. So you would actually think, well, with all these horrible stories in their past, shouldn't they be against each other? No, they are together. And you can go to Romania, you can go to Estonia. I would even partly include Finland into this, because so and to Ukraine, and people would immediately click. They would know what the issues are. There wouldn't be any principal discussion. Whereas when you go then to Germany, you start about how does the world work, and then you would have a professor who would explain to you that it's all not that easy, with this imperialism, and we should be sort of balanced and so on. And the East European, the Central Europeans, which we propose to call them Central Europeans, they would be, they would know what he talks about. So that was a little bit play with words, but I think there is in substance there's something to be made, that of course the colonial experience of these nations, they has today implications for the thinking, for policies, for institution building. It's not a trivial issue. Whether you want to call it then Central European or something else is not so important, but there is this common past that shapes the future.
Thanks. I mean, just looking at this map behind you, I think the IDM would probably count Ukraine to Central Europe.
I think 53.
But I think it should answer yes or no. Is Ukraine Central Europe? Does it matter?
Yeah.
Thank you. I got a lot of questions actually from our colleague Kinga. I will maybe choose one now because it's very recent. She writes, President Joe Biden has just visited Ukraine and Poland. In Poland, the voices are divided on what does this visit mean to Warsaw. Some expected even announcement of permanent presence of NATO troops, which didn't materialize. Was this visit just symbolic and on the way to Ukraine, or is Poland perceived as a key for supporting Ukraine? If not, why? What is the role of Poland? Is Poland like a key partner for Ukraine?
Definitely. I mean, Central Europe has played, when it comes to cooperation and support after the outbreak of the war, a pivotal role, we have to say. And we know that Poland has been always very, very active and a reliable NATO partner. So, I mean, I don't know if I would agree with the view of the establishment of permanent troops there, but I definitely have to say that Poland has played a major role in supporting Ukraine, both on the humanitarian side and on the military side, has never backed up when it comes to helping out Ukraine. And it's also one of those countries, together with the Baltics, that have been always vocal when it comes to the threat represented by Russian Federation. Therefore, I would definitely say that it's more than just a symbolic visit. It was just, I think it's also sending a strong message to Moscow that US is there, NATO is there, and we're not gonna let Russia take or advance one more inch than they actually already done.
So you would agree that it was more symbolic than really like strategic, or?
I think it's a kind of a both.
Yeah.
Because it is symbolic, but it has also strategic value when it comes to strengthening the cooperation.
Just to continue what I said before, we have a representative of one former colony, Joe Biden, visiting other former colonies, and meeting the Bucharest 9 group, which consists of former colonies, Ukraine, a former colony, and they click with each other. They know what it is about. And that's also why I think Zelensky's visit to the US was so successful, because he could refer to how the US liberate. I mean, the US is often seen as an empire, but the US is actually a former colony that came out of an independence war against the colonial empire. So, and that's, that's what connects them also. I think that is one of the reasons why the US is so much more popular in Central or Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. Although you would think, this isn't that the same tradition? Shouldn't the Germans and the French love the Americans much more than the Poles and the Ukrainians? But no, they, there's this sort of anti-Americanism is very rare in Poland and in Ukraine that was still very present in Germany, for instance. I don't know about Austria, but I'm suspecting that is something here as well.
You want to add something to this?
But just the symbolism of it, I would add to that. I mean, there is a US president that walks around Kyiv while air raid sirens are on, whereas there is the colonial president that travels the country only in a fortified train and is afraid to leave his bunker in Moscow. And I think this is adding to that symbolism that at the same time also brings strategic value because it boosts morale and it shows the support.
Thank you. I think we have space for one more question in the room, maybe two more questions. I would like to start with you in the first row. Yes.
Okay. My name is Valeria. I'm a refugee from Ukraine, from Kyiv. I woke up because it sounded the missiles at 6 a.m. And I have a following question about the role of Belarus, because it's just there. They have this key role but on the side of Russia. What's your opinion about that? How do you see the role of Belarus in this war? And is it also kind of physically, like geographically, also in Europe? What's future? What is there a future for Belarus in Europe?
The role that Belarus plays in that war is it's contributing to the destruction and the terror that has happened, because without the possibility, even if Lukashenko maybe tries to sort of actively play a role, there is again until now fighter jets starting from the territory of Belarus, and therefore it's an active player in that war of aggression against Ukraine. Will there be a future? There's this alleged leaked plan that it sort of should be integrated into the Russian Federation by 2030. I sincerely hope that by 2030 we talk about the integration of Ukraine into the European Union, and that at the same time would imply, in the logic that I said in the beginning, that the Russian Federation in its current form doesn't exist anymore, which then would also mean that the threat that is enabled through the, so to say, possibility to use Belarus in this war would also cease to exist. And I think that, of course, also the Belarusian society has a European future. There is, since 2020, the clear, visible divide in the society that strives for a change, much more visible than actually in the Russian Federation, I would argue. And therefore, at the moment, absolutely no possibility to deal with the current administration that is there. But in the future, definitely a European player, although the map of IBM itself is not an indicator of what we would say who should be within the European Union or not. It's historically grown. As I said, there was the reference to the year 1953 when the institute was actually funded, and the scope was actually laid out on a different historical level.
All right, as I look at the map here, the Crimea is still within Ukraine, luckily, and the point is that Crimea was taken 2014, and it was a difference to Luhansk and Donetsk, which was sort of separate, becoming separate republics, as Abkhazia or South Ossetia and Georgia. Now, the point is that Putin decided that 5 oblasts are becoming a part of Russia, and the Duma voted for it, but it is not internationally recognized. And how is this situation then? Why should it be then possible, but probably it needs the end of the Putin regime to change it back? Yeah, because we cannot say no, it's in our constitution, and we cannot move and cannot give it back anymore. So it's also a question probably of the public opinion in Russia, which is a big, certainly a problem for Crimea. This is emotional in Russia, it seems, but about the Donbass area, emotions, are they deciding? Finally, it's weapons deciding, obviously, but there must be a reversal possible.
The constitution
Yeah.
can be changed.
Yeah.
Constitutions can be changed. I don't think.
Now it's a part of Russian constitution, and for any peace talks, it would be impossible, but it has to be possible. There must be some flexibility on the Russian side if there was ever a serious.
I'm not going to explain what Andreas meant. He's very capable of doing that for himself, but I think the difference is that the administration currently has no possibility, but a different administration can change the constitution. We have a situation that Kosovo is seen as an integral part of Serbia in their constitution. So that would have to change if we want to move forward here. And I don't see why constitutions could not change. I see a challenge with the regime in Moscow that anything in regards changing this would be possible.
Yeah, that's something very short on Moldova. The problem is now they are so dependent, still dependent in energy, in gas, by Gazprom, and in supply of energy from the Russian control side. So why is there not a development for years? For instance, Romania has a lot of gas and it could supply. Is there any plan? Are there any plans to make it safer?
But yeah, it's true. I could also say, I mean, it's the same for Austria.
Yeah.
If we look at how high the figures are still and how high the dependency still is, and you wonder, because I mean that was something that was very clear over a decade ago, and we said, oh, such high numbers, such high dependency, we should do something. Nothing happened. Then the war breaks out, and then there are countries that manage to decouple from that dependency, and there are other countries who are less successful. I think that there is a huge possibility with regards to that gas fields that have been discovered in Romania, but it will take time. It will take until 27 until it really will be usable and really be able to replace something here. What is positive in a sense is that that certain energy grids of Moldova, also within the framework of the energy community and with the help of the European Union and its member states, has been connected to the European grid, and there are things underway. But then ultimately, it's of course also probably internal pressure that we would have to see how further developments can be done here. But things are on the way, and I think that the European Union and its member states have understood the challenge that this poses for Moldova, especially given the size. Yeah, it's a relatively small country. There should be a possibility to alleviate that situation.
Thanks.
Maybe here on the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think when one talks about this sort of these territorial gains and so far, one shouldn't forget that so far what each of these territorial gains has been a sort of a victory for Putin, and that's why he did it, and there were no sanctions, there was no real resistance. It was easy, and he thought it would be here with it like that, I mean, and that was also, I think, where then the support for the annexation of Crimea came from. I think, I mean, there were the first 20 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia was without Crimea. It was actually also before without Crimea and so on. So there was this acceleration that was shaped also by a relatively good economic situation. No major confrontation, no military defeat, no dead Russian soldiers. Now we are having a very different situation. And my feeling is that, as Sebastian said, that when military defeats and the effect of the economic sanctions come together at the same time, and I think then we will get a different Russia, because that is not something that the regime can easily stomach. Maybe it can stomach defeats with a good economic situation. Maybe it can stomach an economic crisis and then compensate that with military victories. So one of these, but if both of these come together, I think that is going to change either the regime in Russia, or it could actually lead to a breakup of Russia. That is now more and more discussed, and I'm sort of, the more I think about it, the more it looks also possible to me. And here is actually that is actually the virus that Putin has now introduced into the Russian Federation. Because if these oblasts go again, if Crimea goes again, well, then maybe people will in Kaliningrad or in Khabarovsk or in Karelia, they will think that, in an economic crisis. We are now assuming that this is going to be, in 5 years, the same Russian Federation as now, but I think it's going to be a decline. I don't believe the numbers. Putin just said the GDP fell 2%. That is probably untrue, and they have now war industry that produces a lot that then goes into these statistics, but it does not do any good for the economy and the society. So we will be in a very different world, and then also Crimea. I think militarily Crimea is actually the easiest, because you can easily cut off the supply lines, and that was actually one of the reasons for the war, because they did not have the water from the Dnipro anymore, and so they captured the canal, and they did not have a land connection. But once you destroy the land connection, you reconquer the canal, the North Crimea Canal, and you destroy the bridge, and then maybe you shoot a few ferries. Who will go then on the ferry if the Ukrainians manage to they managed to bring down the Moskva cruiser. So I think Crimea is actually going to be, they don't even have to capture it. They're now building all the installations. The question is how the Russians are going to supply Crimea if the land connection is reconquered and the bridge is destroyed. So I think it will actually it will end with a victory.
Unfortunately, I think we could go on forever. Maybe we can also, after we wrap up here, continue some parts of this discussion. To round this discussion up, today marks 1 year of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What will be the title of our discussion on February 24, 2024?
Well, wishful thinking here, perhaps, but the victory will be I mean, some people think it will last till 2024, the end of 2024 or even 2025. My feeling is there's already going to be, by the end of this year, some sort of break point. So then people discuss, of course, the nuclear option. I don't believe in it because the stakes are just too high, and now also in the G20 meeting, the last ones we had, it seems strong signals from India and China that they would not tolerate, and now with the peace plan with the Chinese also again talking about the nuclear option. So I'm optimistic next year we're going to be here already. I'm not sure where the contact line will be, but it will be definitely more to the advantage of Ukraine.
Optimistic outlook, Sebastian?
I think that the title will be how the Ukrainian victory will shape the future of Central Europe.
Federica?
I foresee, I stay on the optimistic line. I foresee us being again together probably in Kyiv, organizing the same conference and discussing about what is the future of Ukraine inside the European Union.
Great. Optimistic outlooks. I think that's a good way to end this evening. Thank you for coming and sharing your expertise with all of us. Also, thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed this event, make sure to stay updated with our other events. You can subscribe to our newsletter on our website and follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. As I already mentioned, thank you for joining us today. We will stay in touch and see you soon.